Здравствуйте.
Hello again. This is the standoff section. My name is Ivan. Pleasure to welcome you again, and let me introduce Alexey Zakharov, our next speaker. And he is going to talk about how monitoring of the activities of Higaisa, the APT, led to a discovery of another malware coming from a different team. Hi, I'm Alexey Zakharov. I'm an expert in, I'm a research, so let me put it differently. I'm a security and vulnerability researcher at Positive Technologies. And I'm going to tell you the story of a particular research. When we started it, we thought we were looking at Higaisa activities, but in fact, we discovered lots of new information about a totally different group. That's Winnti. And what we discovered, what we learned, is exactly what I'm going to cover in my presentation. But before I do that, let me tell you briefly about PT, Expert Security Center. This is actually a department of Positive Technologies, and we are focusing on three areas. Threat intelligence, where we pretty much monitor the existing threats and we look for new ones. And this is where I work. Next, we have an incident response team. These guys, actually respond to incidents. They do their investigations. And finally, we have a network security division. These guys develop signatures for various exploits, malware, attackers' tactics, and so on. The combined efforts of these three divisions are translated into corporate expertise, which is then crystallized in our products. The story I wanted to share with you starts in March 2020. This is when we heard of Higaisa again. Well, because first time this group actually surfaced previous autumn when they were covered by analysts of Tencent. And it is believed that Higaisa is originally from South Korea, but they are primarily attacking Northern Korean targets. Well, March was the time when the coronavirus spiked across the world. And naturally, there was substantial mass media coverage. So the perps from various groups, including Higaisa, decided to jump on this bandwagon. So what they developed was a malicious link pretending to be a WHO report on COVID spread. What is technically interesting about this attack is that it has malicious code embedded at different levels, and they also have variously obfuscated code extracting payload to different elements of the OS. So the way it works is that it initially fires a CLI code, shown here. We actually started this attack, we covered it in our blog, and we were on the lookout for new samples. So in May 2020, we were alerted to two attacks that use similar links, and you can see a comparison here. The new link is on top. It is not a 100% match, but it should be obvious here that they all work in the same manner. That base 64 payload is extracted, which is then put into a cap archive, and it goes into the temp folder. And the archive contains the payload with a JAS file for the infection code. Actually, the last line here shows how the JavaScript file is actually fired. However, in the new links, the file was actually very different from what we saw coming from Higaisa, because the code was responsible for copying files into target space. It was also responsible for persistence and also for ipconfig, because it used a POIS call to send the output of ipconfig to a certain address. And in various links, we found three different addresses used for this ipconfig reporting. What they all had in common was that they were all located in free-to-use third-level domains. Why were they used in the malicious code is still beyond us. Maybe this is how the attackers wanted to control whether they were successful in the initial stages of infection. Or maybe they simply tried to lead the security researchers astray by pretending that this was an attack that was below the materiality threshold. Oh, because IP config data is certainly a far cry from attacking sensitive data. Let's look at the payload now. It consisted of two files, an executable and a shellcode with a TMP extension. The executable was very simple. It actually downloaded the shellcode and then executed it. The only interesting element of it was that it checked for the current year. Note the second line. It wanted the year to be between 18 or 21, otherwise the loader would simply be terminated. This kind of check we are going to see a bit later in a different piece of malware. So the shellcode itself was the payload, was the main element to be delivered. At the time of the attack, the file itself would not be recognized as malware by any AV on VirusTotal. Before I tell you more about the shellcode, I should probably say a few things about attribution. Our colleagues from Zscaler and Malwarebytes also paid attention to these attacks. They cover them in detail in their reports. And given the similarities in LNK files, researchers agree that should be Higaisa. And they believe that the shellcode is a new sort of proprietary backdoor stemming from the same group. However, our detailed analysis of the shellcode helped us identify we had actually seen it before. For the first time, it was mentioned by FireEye in their report on the activities of APT41, also known as Winnti. And this report was published in 2018. It actually includes a fragment of the code shown in the left-hand part of the screen. The same kind of code we discovered in our sample shown on the right. And they call it crosswalk. The fact that the backdoor of APT41 is being used made us wonder if that indeed was Higaisa. And the research into the network infrastructure helped us drive the last nail into the coffin. Attribution of the service being used in these backdoors leads us to the same SSL certificate, which is associated with another IP address, listed in CloudStrike report from 2018 as part of Winnti infrastructure. More detailed analysis of their infrastructure enabled us to find the first Winnti report, first report on Winnti by Kaspersky Labs in 2013. Here I should actually say a few words about Winnti. There are different names they go by, including APT41, Blackfly, Wicked Panda, Barium, Axiom, and others. Experts believe these guys are originally Chinese and state-sponsored. They have been officially active since 2009. Although Winnti became well-known thanks to their attacks against video games companies, they are certainly interested in many other industries, such as software, healthcare, media, retail, education, and others. Their main targets include espionage and theft of confidential data, although in some cases, they seem to be financially motivated. So what is Crosswalk? The backdoor that we found in the LNK files. It's a modular backdoor. All its components are effectively shellcode. And the main component that we started was responsible for establishing an encrypted connection with the C2 and sending system info to it. After a successful connection to CNC, it could it could install and execute up to 20 modules, as per the command by C2. Since the structure of the backdoor was already covered in the report by VMware Carbon Black, we're simply going to focus now on the interesting aspects that have not been covered much. One of the important fields, one of the important variables, important fields is its current version. And it comes in several modifications, and it uses a special flag to denote it. It can be either 0 or 1. So they use two figures to code the number of the version. Actually, we have seen various versions from 1.0 to 2.0. They all support pretty much the same range of commands, and therefore their functionality should be similar, which doesn't mean they are identical. Version 1.25 was used in this particular attack, and this is what we are going to consider from this moment on. The backdoor has a flexible configuration. It actually is encrypted at the back of the shellcode. This configuration supports limitations for days of week and hours when the backdoor is allowed to connect to the C2. It also contains optional proxies with credentials and numerous C2s. Actually, each C2 has, or at least can have a port mentioned and one of 4 connection types possible. At the applied level, the code itself consists of fake TLS header, followed by a command ID shown in yellow, data size indication shown in green, and a client ID shown in red. Client ID is generated each time the backdoor is started. And all this is followed by the command itself, shown in gray. So like I said, an encrypted connection is mounted to the C2. The first packets exchanged between them will contain commands 65H and 64H, and they will contain data required to generate session keys. AES 128 algo will be used to encrypt the content of all the following packets except for the headers, which means that we can only see the first 2 packets. Transportation type is chosen in the config, and this is exactly the type of connection I mentioned. There are 4 transport options available. One is the vanilla TCP protocol. Next one is somewhat similar to HTTP long polling technique, where we effectively have 2 connections. One is used to send a GET request, a GET query, while messages from the server are sent as a stream, as a continuous response. And POST requests are used to send responses by the client. The third transport protocol, I guess, is the most interesting one. Let's look at its structure. First, a regular TLS connection is established, and HTTP GET request is sent via it, and then the pair of the IP address and the port used to establish the connection are used to identify the initial socket associated with the TCP connection. The socket itself comes with no encryption equipped. Then it's sort of doubled, and it will be used from that moment on, which is sort of similar to the first protocol, which is TCP. A fake TLS header that it starts with helps us see it as a continuation of the TLS session. And the final protocol here is KCP. It's actually a protocol you can establish on top of any other protocol, such as UDP, for example, and according to the developers, it supports fast and reliable data transfer. In the case of Crosswalk, it works on top of TCP. So for the applied level messages, they are adding TCP headers shown in yellow here. And once appended like this, it's all sent as TCP packets. Of all the Crosswalk instances, and we've been able to identify about 15, we have not seen a single sample that would actually use KCP. However, the code supports full-fledged KCP functionality, so all you need to do is simply pull the switch in the config. We believe that this diversity of protocols should enable the backdoor to effectively disguise itself as legitimate traffic, and therefore avoid detection. As we searched for other instances of Crosswalk, we're able to identify other malware which contains Crosswalk backdoor as a payload. It could all be split into two groups, injectors and loaders. And loaders, in turn, could be further stratified into two buckets. Self-contained loaders, and these are those that have the shellcode for the backdoor inside the loader itself, and those where the shellcode lives in an external file. Some of them are actually covered with the VM protect protector. Injectors are nothing special. They use a pretty standard technique for injecting code by calling write process memory and create remote thread. The payload itself will always be in the data section of the injector, and it can be either Crosswalk or a Metasploit stager or a funny switch. We are going to return to funny switch a bit later. Target processes are Explorer and WinLogon. The objective of the loaders is to actually load the shellcode in an incumbent, in an already running process. Note the first lines here, because we have a year check, and it is very similar to what we actually saw previously. The shellcode that the loaders are using is of particular interest. It has a pretty special structure. It consists of 96-byte header starting with a PL signature, and PL is followed with the encrypted shellcode. The key and the nonce will be taken from the header. The encryption algorithm, depending on a particular sample, can be either ChaCha20 or AES-128, which means that the loader, before it executes the shellcode, will check the size and will check actually the length of the header, will check the PL signature, will then use one of the algos to decrypt the shellcode, and then will fire it. The loaders that use external files are not really different from the self-contained ones. And the name of the external files will be kind of hard-coded and encrypted as well. And the encryption used is the same, ChaCha20 or AES-128. Examples of names of external files are shown on the screen. This arrangement with an external file is actually more resistant to analysis by researchers. If the researchers only see the executable, the loader file itself, they will not be able to learn what it is that it tried to achieve. In fact, among all the loaders, we're able to identify 3 types of payload, which is crosswalk, Metasploit stager, and in this particular case, it was Cobalt Strike beacon. Let's take a short respite from technicalities and feast our eyes on a particular example. Let's start with an encrypted CV. So attackers were actually propagating links to encrypted archive, RAR archive, contained in a server they controlled. So we actually see here what purports to be an encrypted CV in a PDF file and an exe file for reading it, which is sort of funny because it's the same file. CRC32 actually says that. And both of them actually do the same thing. They upload Cobalt Strike beacon, and the CNC server for it is located in the same server used to propagate, to distribute the archive. Well, the names are in Russian, so you can easily guess that Russian users were the target. However, the modification date is very similar to the date of distribution, which is 1st of June. So we can make this conclusion that the attack must have been particularly active around that time. A very similar attack around the same time. Russian in the slide says chat log 1 and so on. So all of them are executable files, and here perps are simply trying to lead the users astray by adding lots of underscore symbols, hoping that users will only see the PNG in the end. Note that crosswalk is used here as the payload. I guess the most interesting attack here is the one that used an archive called video.rar. Actually, the files themselves are nothing new. They are autonomous loaders of the PL shellcode for Cobalt Strike beacon. As regards the MP4 file, it is in fact a real video containing in fact a news bite on American protests following the death of George Floyd in late May. Judging by the logo, the video comes from an Australian portal called XKB, and they specialize in publishing news in Chinese. Because of this, the archive is actually pretty fat at 30 megabytes, which is sort of unusual for such malicious payloads, or rather malicious ware. One of the classical techniques used by Win and NCI involves stealing certificates for signing code. Compromised certificates will then be used by the perps to sign the files they will use in follow-up attacks. We have been able to identify a certificate like this, owned by a Taiwanese company called Zila Digital. And the files that were used to sign, were signed with this certificate were used to attack primarily Hong Kongese company. And they use them in line with Crosswalk, Metasploit, Juicy Potato LP tool, Shadowpad, and Funny Switch. In my speech, I've mentioned Funny Switch several times already, and I'm guessing this does not ring much of a bell to you. This is simply because we came up with this name for a backdoor we have never seen before. And we discovered it as we, did our analysis. It is called this way because of the name of the library and one of the key classes. So it was written in .NET. It can collect system info. It can execute arbitrary JavaScript code. It supports 6 types of connection, including the ability to be a server. And one of its key features is that it can be a message router between various infected machines and the server, on the C2 server. So it all starts with an SFX RAR archive, which contains 2 shellcode injectors and a VB script, which launches them. The shellcode itself is here, and the code will get a link to the needed interface. It will create an app domain object, and then it launches a static method called funny.core. And this method will then be sort of formatted into XML, and this also hard-coded in the code. What we saw in the SFX archive, these 2 different files are only different in terms of their configuration. We actually saw similar proxies in some samples of Crosswalk. And as regards the C2 server, it is funny because, see, they're using something that looks like Kaspersky website, but it isn't. And it was actually listed in the FBI report this April, I think, covering lots of attacks against healthcare institutions. Note that it actually limits network activity to the backdoor on certain hours and days of the week. And Funny Switch is using a single connector, which is HTTP. Although the code actually provides for 6, 3 for the server, 3 for the client. And they're using HTTP, HTTPS, TCP, and named pipe connectors. The sample can have a random number of connectors of any type. Unlike Crosswalk, Funny Switch has 3 levels of protocols, not just 2. Besides the transport layer, it also has the network layer, where packet routing happens. Each running sample will have its own ID to support it, and this ID is either set up in the config or is generated as GUI when the backdoor kicks into operation. With the help of these connectors, each node can maintain several connections to other nodes using different protocols. Look at ID3 in our layout. Network-level messages support establishment of connections between 2 directly linked nodes. Thereby, they exchange system information, and this is how they actually ensure consistency between IDs and connectors used to address specific IDs in their dictionary, which is analogous to a switching table. Also, same network messages support sending data to several addresses pursuant to a pre-configured route, and they have source and destination lists in order to do that. For example, if ID3 wants to send a message to ID5 via ID4, in stage 1, the switch message will read something like you see in the bottom of the screen. Now let's look at the commands supported by this backdoor. Invoke is arguably the most important one because it uses the tools of the .NET platform in order to fire the JScript code downloaded. Actually, it's this important functionality takes up only 4 lines and can be separately uploaded. The other commands are responsible for dealing with streams and connectors. For example, the connect command can add a new connector. Update will send the switching table to C2, as well as system information on all the connected nodes, while the query command will help it learn about active connectors and their configurations, while a remove command will remove a given connector. Streams here are in fact lines of byte arrays, and apparently this is an unfinished branch of the project, because so far it can only append data, and data that's added to the queue doesn't get used, which means that the functionality is not finalized. As we studied Funny Switch, we got the impression that we saw something like this before. And indeed, Funny Switch and Crosswalk do have a lot in common. For example, they have this flexible configuration of C2, relying on diversity of transport protocols supported. Proxy can be configured, restrictions on time of day and days of week. Their backdoors also rely on a relatively unpopular KCP protocol. Actually, KCP is supported on Funny Switch, although it doesn't get used. Both backdoors are the work of professionals, and they actually use this advanced practice of logging debug messages and errors. Although by default it's switched off. This makes us think that both backdoors come from the same party. Another interesting malware, which was also signed with a Zelo digital certificate, turned out to be ShadowPad. And ShadowPad also came as part of SFX archive, which contained a bait. And it also had a VBS script, which would ensure that once you open the archive, all the stuff gets launched. Log.exe and logdll were covered with VM Protect. The executable file turned out to be a legitimate component of Bitdefender, which actually would load the logdll library. And this is indeed an interesting technique, because at the time of loading, the library will check for the number of bytes, and it will use a fixed offset. If the module it finds is OK, it will change the bytes to a call instruction, which will summon a function from the DLL. If this happens, once logdll is uploaded, logexe will be started, and a library function will be triggered. However, this function is not clearly exported, and the same technique was covered in January this year by ESAT. It was connected to Winnti attacks versus or against the University of Hong Kong, and ShadowPad was indeed used in those attacks. However, we see the perps using a different obfuscation technique here, both for the code that decrypts and uploads the payload. Here I'm referring to this call function. But it also applies to the shellcode of ShadowPad itself, and it is contained in the DAT file. The way this obfuscation works is as follows. All the code is broken down into individual instructions, and these instructions are mixed up. Transitions between instructions happen by a call of a specific function called rel-gmp. It emulates what jump does. The offset is actually written right after the call instruction. So what you see shown, in a red fence, so to speak, it's effectively a single jump command. In order to make it even more difficult to discern, the code will contain some notional jumps that are never followed. The way it works at ESP will be compared to value which is guaranteed to be below the minimum threshold, and therefore it proceeds to the next jump command block. The encrypted configuration of ShadowPad contains the lines you see in the slide. It also includes the module creation date, a number of parameters, and also we can see the C2 server here and the domain we know so well, kaspersky.info. It is the one that was used by FunnySwitch. Its subdomains were listed in the FBI report. Research into the network infrastructure of crosswalk backdoors led us to several other important discoveries. We're able to identify another instance of ShadowBat, as well as PlugX. Well, PlugX is a tool that has been used by various APTs for quite some time. And they seem to have a special preference for Google Docs. The SFX archive being distributed only contains the loader, and the loader will download and launch shellcode from a public Google Docs document. The shellcode contains links to different Google documents it can actually use to collect encoded addresses of other C2 servers. And this is how it can actually, enrich or enlarge on its hard-coded list of C2s. It turned out that the same code could be found in another malware sample. What was interesting about it was that it actually had a special bat file which was designed to actually remove the traces of installation of malware. Samples were similar, control server was the same, and it all led us to a report by Palo Alto Networks on Paranoid plugins, published in 2017. According to Unit 42, the main objective of the attacks with this sample were video games companies. And we remember that Winnti specializes in these attacks. We find another proof for the link between Winnti and Paranoid plugins as we study the network infrastructure. The update server, upgrade dot something, leads us to the address listed in a FireEye report on APT41, which is actually the one we used to attribute crosswalk, which means that we've completed the circle. Let's try to summarize it. Winnti is still quite active. They are using a broad array of malware for their attacks, including both mainstream tools such as PlugX or Metasploit, but also some of their proprietary tools. And their list of proprietary tools keeps getting expanded. No later than May this year, they started using a new backdoor called FunnySwitch, or at least that's how we call it. And their existing backdoors are getting some facelifts as well. They're using different attack chains, and they're also using samples from other APTs. And they also stay hidden from the eyes of the researchers. It is difficult in my presentation to cover all the details, but if you found my presentation interesting, we are going to publish a detailed report on this research very soon, and you can find us over here. If you don't want to miss on the publication of a new article, you can actually follow us on Twitter, TI_ESC. This is it for my presentation. Thank you very much. I am ready to take your questions, if any, using the chat. Thank you.